The morning sun of September 15th, 1950, cast long shadows across the yellow sea as General Douglas MacArthur stood on the bridge of the USS Mount McKinley, watching the impossible unfold before his eyes. 261. Ships stretched across the horizon like a steel armada of liberation, their hulls cutting through waters that had witnessed centuries of conflict, but never an operation quite this audacious. Behind him, Korean Peninsula burned. For 3 months, Communist forces had driven United Nations troops into a desperate corner around the port city of Pusan, where American, British, and South Korean forces clung to a shrinking perimeter like castaways on a rapidly eroding island. The newspapers back home painted grim pictures of retreat and defeat, with headlines screaming about the possibility of another. Dunkirk in the Far East. MacArthur's weathered fingers traced the battle plans one final time, his mind calculating odds that would have given lesser commanders nightmares. Inchon was not just any port city. It was a fortress protected by nature itself, surrounded by 30-foot tides that could strand invading ships like beached whales, defended by mudflats that could swallow entire battalions, and guarded by fortified islands that commanded every approach. Military experts had called his plan impossible, suicidal, even madness. Yet here they were, racing against time and tied toward what would become either the most brilliant amphibious assault in military history or the most spectacular failure of the Korean War. The stakes could not have been higher. If successful, this daring gambit would cut communist supply lines, recapture Seoul, and potentially save South Korea from complete conquest. If it failed, the remnants of the United Nations command might be swept into the sea, leaving the Korean Peninsula under communist control and America's credibility in the cold. War severely damaged, as dawn broke fully over the invasion fleet. MacArthur could see the first objective rising from the morning mist. Wolmi Island, a heavily fortified outcropping that guarded Inchon harbor like a medieval castle. North Korean guns bristled from its heights, their crews no doubt watching the approaching armada with a mixture of disbelief and determination. The island had to fall first, or the entire operation would crumble before it began. The general's aide approached with the latest intelligence reports. Communist forces had been reinforcing their positions around Inchon for weeks, but they still seemed convinced that any major Allied offensive would come at the Pusan perimeter, where the fighting had raged for months. This element of surprise might be their only advantage against an enemy that had proven remarkably adaptable and tenacious throughout the conflict. Radio. Chatter filled the air as final preparations commenced. Landing craft loaded with Marines bobbed in the swells, their young occupants checking weapons and equipment with the methodical precision of professional warriors. Who knew that the next few hours would determine not just their own fates, but the future of an entire nation? The die was cast and there would be no turning back from this collision course with destiny. The first shells screamed overhead at exactly 5:45 in the morning, their distinctive whistle cutting through the morning air like harbingers of apocalypse. USS Rochester, USS Jamaica, and USS Kenya opened the bombardment with devastating precision, their heavy guns turning Wolmi Island's fortifications into fountains of concrete and steel. The North Korean defenders, caught in their morning routines, scrambled to battle stations as explosions erupted across their positions. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, watched the barrage from his landing craft with professional interest. His men would be among the first to set foot on Korean soil, tasked with capturing the island that controlled access to Inchon harbor. The preliminary bombardment was impressive, but Murray had seen enough combat in the Pacific War to know that artillery alone rarely eliminated determined defenders, as reported in the New York Times coverage of the operation. The amphibious assault on Wolmi Island represented one of the most challenging military operations undertaken by American forces since World War II. The island's geography worked against the attackers at every turn. Steep cliffs rose directly from the water, providing natural defensive positions that could withstand tremendous punishment. Underground bunkers and caves offered additional protection to defenders, who had spent months preparing for exactly this scenario. At 6:30, the first wave of landing craft approached the island's northern shore. Marine Corsair fighters screamed, Overhead, their rockets and machine guns adding to the crescendo of destruction. The shallow waters around Wolmi Island forced the landing craft to navigate carefully, as any vessel that ran aground would become a sitting target for North Korean artillery. The defenders of Wolmi Island were not merely going to roll over as the Marines approached the beach. Hidden gun positions opened fire with deadly accuracy. Mortar rounds began falling among the landing craft, sending geysers of seawater high into the air. Several boats took direct hits, their crews struggling to maintain formation as wounded men cried out for coursemate. Captain Robert Barrow's company hit the beach first, their boots splashing through the surf as they charged toward the base of the cliffs. The North Koreans had prepared well, with machine gun nests positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the narrow landing zones. Bullets whined overhead as the Marines sought whatever cover they could find among the rocks and debris. The battle for Wolmi Island quickly devolved into a series of small unit actions, as Marine squads worked their way up the steep slopes, using grenades and flamethrowers to clear bunkers one by one. The North Korean defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that their position was hopeless but determined to extract the highest possible price from the attackers. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in several locations as the fighting reached close quarters. By mid-morning, American casualties were mounting, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Superior firepower, combined with the exceptional training and motivation of the Marine assault troops, gradually overwhelmed the island's defenders. One by one, the North Korean strongpoints fell silent, their guns destroyed or abandoned as surviving defenders retreated to interior positions. The final North Korean position fell at 11:15, marked by the raising of an American flag on the island's highest point. Wolmi Island was secure, but the real test still lay ahead. The main assault on Inchon itself would begin with the evening tide, and the North Koreans would not be caught by surprise a second time. The afternoon hours of September 15th crawled by with agonizing slowness as the invasion fleet repositioned for the main assault on Inchon. Every man involved in the operation understood the critical nature of timing. The harbor's extreme tidal conditions meant they had only a brief window of opportunity when the water would be deep enough for their ships to approach the shore. Miss that window, and the entire force would be stranded in the mudflats, sitting ducks for North Korean artillery. Major General Oliver Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, studied reconnaissance photographs of Inchon's waterfront with growing concern. City's seawalls rose 15 feet above the high tide mark, creating what amounted to medieval fortifications that would have to be scaled under fire. Intelligence reports indicated that North Korean forces had spent considerable effort fortifying these positions, installing machine guns and mortar at regular intervals along the defensive line. The approach to Inchon was treacherous, even without enemy interference. Flying Fish Channel, the main shipping route into the harbor, was narrow and winding, with strong currents that could sweep unwary vessels onto hidden rocks or sandbanks. North Korean engineers had also placed mines throughout the channel, requiring careful navigation by specially trained pilots who knew every hazard and landmark. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the second wave of the invasion began moving toward shore. Unlike the morning assault on Wolmi Island, this attack would be conducted in broad daylight against a fully alerted enemy. North Korean reinforcements had been rushing toward Inchon throughout the day, and communist artillery positions in the surrounding hills had zeroed in on likely landing zones. The Marines faced a unique challenge in urban amphibious warfare. Most of their previous experience had been gained fighting on Pacific islands, where they could establish secure beachheads and gradually expand their perimeters. Inchon offered no such luxury. They would have to fight their way directly into a defended city, clearing buildings and streets while maintaining their momentum toward strategic objectives. Captain John Stevens led the first boat to reach Red Beach, a designated landing zone near the heart of Inchon's industrial district. His company scrambled up scaling ladders thrown against the seawall as North Korean bullets chipped concrete around them. The defenders had positioned themselves well, using factory buildings and warehouses as fighting positions that provided excellent fields of fire across the landing area. Street fighting erupted immediately as Marines pushed inland from the seawall. North Korean soldiers had prepared defensive positions in virtually every building, forcing the attackers to clear each structure methodically. The urban environment favored the defenders, who could retreat from building to building while inflicting casualties on the advancing. Americans' tank support proved crucial in breaking through the most stubborn defensive positions. Sherman tanks rumbled through Inchon's narrow streets, their 75mm guns demolishing North Korean strongpoints at point-blank range. The psychological effect of armor support was equally important, as many North Korean soldiers had never faced tanks in urban combat and were unprepared for their devastating firepower by nightfall. Marine units had penetrated several miles inland, securing key road junctions and communication centers. The amphibious phase of the operation was essentially complete, but the real work of liberating Inchon had only just begun. North Korean forces were regrouping in the city's outskirts, preparing for a counteroffensive that could still throw the invaders back into the sea. The pre-dawn hours of September 16th brought an eerie silence to the war-torn streets of Inchon. Marines huddled in defensive positions throughout the captured portions of the city, their weapons trained on shadowy approaches where North Korean infiltrators might appear at any moment. The successful amphibious assault had been only the beginning. Now came the grinding work of urban warfare against an enemy fighting for their homeland. Colonel Lewis Puller, commanding the 1st Marine Regiment, had positioned his battalions to control the main roads leading into Inchon from the north and east. Intelligence reports suggested that North Korean forces were massing in these directions, preparing to launch coordinated counterattacks designed to drive the invaders back into the Yellow Sea. The Marines had limited ammunition and supplies, making it essential to hold their positions until reinforcements could be landed at 4:20 in the morning. The North Korean counteroffensive began with a massive artillery barrage that shook buildings throughout the occupied zone. Communist gunners had spent the previous day registering their weapons on key positions, and their fire was devastatingly accurate. Shells crashed into Marine command posts, supply dumps, and defensive positions with methodical precision. The infantry assault followed immediately. North Korean soldiers, advancing through the rubble-strewn streets in small groups that used cover and concealment with professional skill. These were not the raw recruits that had been encountered in the early weeks of the war, but seasoned veterans who understood urban combat tactics and were willing to die rather than surrender their positions. Sergeant Robert Wilson's squad occupied a reinforced position in a bombed-out warehouse near the city center when the attack began. Through the smoke and dust, he could see North Korean soldiers moving from building to building, their movements coordinated and purposeful. When they opened fire, their aim was accurate and deadly, forcing the Marines to keep their heads down. As bullets shattered windows and sparked off concrete walls, the fighting quickly became a series of individual battles as North Korean assault teams attempted to isolate and overwhelm isolated Marine positions. Communications became difficult as radio antennas were shot away and telephone lines cut by shellfire. Company commanders found themselves fighting their own separate wars, making tactical decisions based on incomplete information about the overall situation. Tank support proved crucial once again as Sherman crews worked their way through the streets, engaging North Korean positions at close range. The narrow confines of urban warfare made tank operations extremely hazardous, with enemy soldiers able to approach within grenade range before being detected. Several tanks were disabled by satchel charges thrown from upper-story windows or basement positions. The most critical moment came at mid-morning when North Korean forces managed to penetrate to within 2 blocks of the main supply beach. If they could seize control of the landing area, the entire invasion force would be cut off from reinforcement and resupply. Marine reserves were rushed forward to plug the gap, engaging in desperate fighting among warehouses and loading docks. By noon, the communist counteroffensive had been contained, but at considerable cost. Marine casualties were mounting steadily, and ammunition supplies were running dangerously low. The successful defense of Inchon had been achieved, but the Marines were in no condition to launch an immediate offensive toward their ultimate objective, the recapture of Seoul, South Korea's capital city. The morning of September 17th dawned clear and cold, as Marine engineers worked frantically to expand the Inchon beachhead into a proper logistical base. The success of the amphibious assault meant nothing if sufficient supplies and reinforcements could not be brought ashore to sustain the offensive. Every hour of delay gave North Korean forces more time to prepare defensive positions between Inchon and Seoul. General MacArthur came ashore that morning, his dramatic arrival carefully staged for the benefit of war correspondents who had accompanied the invasion fleet. The 70-year-old commander strode through the devastated streets of Inchon with the confidence of a man who had just pulled off one of the most audacious military operations in modern history. His presence boosted morale among the Marines, who had begun to question whether their isolated position could be maintained. The breakout from Inchon required careful coordination between multiple Marine battalions advancing along separate axes toward the SHO metropolitan area. The terrain favored defenders with numerous ridgelines and river crossings that could be turned into formidable obstacles by determined troops with adequate preparation time. North Korean commanders understood this as well as their American counterparts. Colonel Homer Litzenberg's 7th Marine Regiment drew the assignment of advancing directly towards Seoul along the main highway. This route offered the fastest approach to the capital, but was also the most heavily defended. With North Korean forces having established multiple defensive lines across the road, the advance would require a series of coordinated attacks to reduce each position before moving forward. The first major obstacle appeared at Kimpo Airfield, a strategic installation that controlled air access to the Seoul area. North Korean forces had fortified the perimeter with interlocking defensive positions that commanded excellent fields of fire across the open approaches. The airfield's runways and buildings provided additional cover for defenders who were determined to hold their positions at any cost. Captain Frank Mutzel's company led the assault on Kimpo's eastern perimeter, advancing across open ground under heavy machine gun and mortar fire. The North Koreans had prepared their positions well, with camouflaged bunkers that were difficult to spot until Marines were well within range. Several squads took heavy casualties before they could identify and neutralize the most dangerous firing positions. Air support proved decisive in breaking the deadlock at Kimpo. Marine Corsair fighters, operating from carriers offshore, delivered devastating attacks on North Korean positions with napalm and high-explosive bombs. The psychological effect of close air support was as important as its destructive power. As many North Korean soldiers abandoned their positions when faced with repeated air attacks, the capture of Kimpo Airfield on September 18th marked a crucial milestone in the advance towards Seoul. American engineers immediately began repairing the runways, knowing that land-based air support would be essential for the coming battle in the capital. The airfield also provided a secure base for the continued advance, with its open terrain making it relatively easy to defend against counterattacks. By September 19th, Marine spearheads had advanced to within artillery range of Seoul's outskirts. The rapid progress of the breakout had surprised even optimistic planners, who had expected much stiffer resistance from North Korean forces. The success at Inchon was beginning to pay strategic dividends as communist commanders struggled to respond to this unexpected threat to their rear areas. However, the real test still lay ahead. Seoul was not just another objective, but the political and emotional heart of South Korea. North Korean forces would defend it with everything they had, knowing that its loss would represent a devastating blow to their cause throughout the Korean peninsula. The ancient city of Seoul spread before the advancing Marines like a sprawling maze of tradition and modernity. Centuries-old palaces and temples, interspersed with industrial districts and government buildings that represented Korea's rapid emergence into the 20th century. For the communist forces defending the capital, this urban landscape offered countless opportunities to slow the American advance through street-by-street fighting that could last for weeks. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, studied the approaches to Seoul from an observation post established on a hill overlooking the Han River. The North Koreans had blown the main bridges crossing the river, forcing the Marines to either find alternative crossing sites or conduct opposed river crossings under fire. Either option would be costly in terms of time and casualties. Intelligence reports painted a sobering picture of the defenses awaiting the assault forces. North Korean commanders had concentrated their best remaining troops in Seoul, including elements of the 4th Division that had been rushed south from positions near the 38th parallel. These were veteran soldiers who had proven their effectiveness in the initial offensive that had nearly conquered South Korea. The civilian population of Seoul complicated military planning considerably. Hundreds of thousands of Korean civilians remained in the city, many of them trapped by the rapid movement of battle lines. American commanders were determined to minimize civilian casualties. But this humanitarian concern would limit their ability to use the heavy firepower that had proven so effective in previous engagements. September 22nd marked the beginning of the assault on Seoul proper, with Marine battalions advancing across the Han River at multiple points. The river crossing operation required careful coordination between infantry, artillery, and engineer units working under constant enemy observation. North Korean artillery positions in the hills surrounding Seoul had excellent fields of fire. Across the likely crossing sites, Captain Joseph Fegan's company crossed the Han River in assault boats during the pre-dawn hours, their movement covered by an intensive artillery barrage that sought to suppress North Korean defensive positions. The crossing itself went smoothly, but the real fighting began as soon as the Marines attempted to establish a beachhead on the north bank of the river. Street fighting in Seoul proved even more challenging than the urban combat in Inchon. Watch what the walls. I bitch right to the wind I wanna yet I wanna one which out I da ado we all by one I we out I wet I'm on some south the weed I buy out of city's narrow alleys and densely packed buildings created a three-dimensional battlefield where danger could appear from any direction. North Korean soldiers had prepared defensive positions in sewers, subway tunnels, and basement bunkers that were almost impossible to detect until Marines were well within range. The battle for Seoul's Central District became a building-by-building struggle that tested the Marines' training and endurance to the limit. Each structure had to be cleared methodically, with teams of riflemen supported by engineers with demolition charges. The process was slow, dangerous, and exhausting. But it was the only way to ensure that North Korean defenders were actually eliminated rather than simply bypassed. Tank support remained crucial, but the urban environment made armored operations extremely hazardous. North Korean anti-tank teams, armed with rocket launchers and satchel charges, could approach within close range before being detected. Several Shermans were disabled in the narrow streets, their hulks becoming obstacles that blocked the advance of follow-on forces. By September 25th, Marine units had fought their way to within sight of Seoul's government district. The capture of the capital was now only a matter of time, but the cost had been substantial. Casualties were mounting steadily, and many units were operating at well below authorized strength. The question was whether the Marines could maintain their offensive momentum long enough to complete the liberation of Seoul. The morning of September 28, 19, brought an unusual quiet to the war-torn streets of Seoul, as the last pockets of North Korean resistance finally collapsed. Marine patrols moved cautiously through neighborhoods that had been battlefields only hours earlier, their weapons ready, but their faces showing the exhaustion of men who had fought continuously for nearly 2 weeks to reach this moment. General MacArthur's motorcade wound through the devastated capital that afternoon, past burned-out buildings and rubble-filled streets that testified to the ferocity of the recent fighting. The general had come to Seoul for a ceremony that would symbolically restore the South Korean government to its rightful seat of power. But the real significance of the moment went far beyond mere symbolism. The recapture of Seoul represented a complete reversal of fortune in the Korean War. Just 3 months earlier, communist forces had seemed on the verge of conquering the entire Korean peninsula, with United Nations troops clinging desperately to a shrinking perimeter around Pusan. The success of the Inchon landing had not only relieved that pressure, but had fundamentally altered the strategic balance throughout. Northeast Asia, President Syngman Rhee of South Korea stood beside MacArthur as they surveyed the liberated capital. His weathered face showing the strain of months spent in exile, while his country fought for its very existence. The restoration ceremony would take place in the same building where Rhee had been forced to flee Seoul ahead of the North Korean advance, making the moment doubly meaningful for all participants. The strategic implications of the Inchon operation extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. Communist supply lines throughout South Korea had been severed, forcing North Korean units to retreat rapidly northward or face encirclement and destruction. The myth of communist invincibility that had sustained morale during the dark days of summer had been shattered by the audacious amphibious assault. Captain James Houseman, an American advisor who had worked closely with South Korean forces throughout the conflict, reflected on the broader lessons of the campaign as he watched Marines establishing security perimeters around government buildings. The success at Inchon had demonstrated that communist forces could be defeated by conventional military means,
provided that democratic nations possess the will and resources to resist aggression.
The human cost of the operation had been significant, but not prohibitive by the standards of modern warfare. Marine casualties totaled approximately 500 killed and wounded during the entire Seoul campaign, while North Korean losses were estimated in the thousands. More importantly, the rapid success of the operation had prevented the prolonged urban warfare that could have devastated Seoul and its civilian population. International reaction to the Inchon landing was overwhelmingly positive among America's allies, who saw the operation as proof that the United States possessed both the military capability and political determination to defend democratic principles in the Cold War era. The success also strengthened MacArthur's reputation as one of history's great military strategists, though his subsequent decisions would prove more controversial. As the sun set over Seoul on September 28th, the Korean War entered a new phase that would bring both opportunities and dangers. The success at Inchon had saved South Korea from communist conquest, but it had also set the stage for Chinese intervention and a much larger conflict that would test American resolve for years to come. The amphibious assault that had seemed so impossible just 2 weeks earlier had indeed become the turning point that MacArthur had promised, though its ultimate consequences would unfold in ways that none of the participants could have foreseen. Battle of Inchon stands today as one of the most brilliant tactical operations in military history, testament to the power of audacious planning combined with exceptional execution. Its success not only saved South Korea but established the pattern of American military intervention that would define the Cold War era throughout Asia and beyond.